Welcome to all of you as we prepare for our virtual journey of the historic Church of St. Martin's, located along the seaside of Worcester County, Maryland. Our job today is to place this venerable old structure in its historical, geographic, and demographic context, to prepare you for your actual walk through the church and its environs in the near future. Not knowing of your knowledge of this area or of its history, I apologize in advance if this presentation is too simplistic. To begin with, what many people do not realize is that this area holds the oldest, most complete historical records in British-speaking America. Unbroken since 1632, these records tell the story of our area and its place in American history. We will begin with a snippet of history to contextualize the significant structure geographically and demographically. Although there is ample evidence that the eastern shore of Virginia was being settled as early as 1612, the area of north of Virginia's eastern shore was not settled until around 1650. Among the early settlers who formed Maryland's first eastern shore communities were religious dissenters, Presbyterians and Quakers pushed north by Virginia's harsh religious laws. By 1651, the few Anglicans were also heading northward into the lower eastern shore of Maryland. However, there is no evidence of an Anglican church building found in the records of Somerset County until the early 18th century. Probably the earliest priests traveled from house to house ministering, or in good weather, preaching out of doors. The earliest recorded priest, the Reverend John Hewitt, acted as minister to the entire area of the lower eastern shore of Maryland for 18 years, beginning in 1680 and continuing until 1696. In 1692, the Protestant Revolution of Maryland deprived the Catholic Lord Calvert of many of his traditional rights. At that time, the province of Maryland officially came to have an established church, the Anglican Church, although Anglicans were far outnumbered by Presbyterians and Quakers at the time. As the Eastern Shore continued to grow in population, a local governance system consisting of hundreds was established. Then, in 1692, with the creation of an established church, parishes were also set up with vestrymen elected largely for the purpose of taxation. The Anglican clergy was supported by a tax of 40 pounds of tobacco levied on each tithable person in the parish, regardless of religious affiliation. At this time, the entire lower eastern shore consisted of only one county, Somerset. And St. Martin's, our subject today, was included within the bounds of that original county, which was not split into two counties until 1742, with the separation of Worcester County from its parent county, Somerset. The original seaside parish church was set up in the village of Snow Hill, which had been established in 1686. Snow Hill was located within Bogerton-Norton 100, which by 1696 had 353 taxable inhabitants. Just above Bogerton-Norton 100 was Baltimore 100, the sparsely settled area in which St. Martin's Church was to be built as a chapel of ease of the Snow Hill Church. With the growth of the seaside population, a chapel of ease was necessary in the more northerly area, which was a half-day's travel from the county seat of Snow Hill itself. That chapel of ease of Snow Hill Parish, erected at St. Martin's, was built before 1703. Although the exact date of the founding of the church is not known, the church was in existence when it is mentioned in a will in 1703. The present St. Martin's structure, built between 1756 and 1763, is one of the most historically important buildings on the seaside of Maryland. It was a chapel of ease of Snow Hill Church. Since Snow Hill Parish extended into the north of what is now southern Delaware, a second chapel of ease was later created in Sussex County, Delaware, and was called Prince George's Chapel, located near present-day Dagsboro, Delaware. All this vast area was part of Somerset County from 1665 until 1742, when Worcester County was carved out of Somerset County. 2 years later, in 1744, the Maryland Provincial Assembly established Worcester Parish out of what had once been Snow Hill or All Hallows Parish. From that time, St. Martin's was now in Worcester Parish rather than in All Hallows Parish. The exact location of the original Chapel of Ease at St. Martin's is unknown, although it is probable that it was located near the present structure. By 1739, a branch of St. Martin's River was identified on maps as the Chapel Branch, where the church was located. Although it has never been more than a crossroads, St. Martin's did have not only a chapel, but also a mill and a storehouse and some houses located on that prong of the St. Martin's River. Future hopes are to reconstruct a waterway near the church to illustrate the probable usual mode of transportation to and from the chapel by communicants. As the seaside society began to develop, planters increased their holdings and began to build houses. First, the houses were of impermanent architecture, usually one room with a loft and measuring no more than 16 to 20 feet. As merchants and planters prospered, larger houses took the place of the earlier lodgings, and in some cases, massive baronial homes, such as Geneser, built about 1730 by the Purnell family, were erected. Nearby was Ratcliffe House, another great house constructed in the 1740s by the great landed and maritime Ratcliffe family. A few miles north of Geneser was Fassett House, a structure with diapering pattern brickwork having the same general appearance as St. Martin's Church, a central door with large windows on either side of the doorway. That brings us to our subject today, St. Martin's Episcopal Church. A glance through the panes of the second-floor gallery window of historic St. Martin's Church draws us into the romance and history of this venerable structure, once the center of a bustling rural community dominated by strong religious traditions. Standing on a small knoll surrounded on two sides by pine groves, the churchyard for years was largely overgrown, with only a few gravestones still standing to indicate the past importance of this site. St. Martin's has had a 300-year history involving not only religion, but also reflecting social and economic aspects of colonial and early national life. This church structure, built between 1756 and 1759, is one of the earliest examples of a brick house of worship still surviving in the mid-Atlantic region. The church was named for St. Martin of Tours in France, who lived during the 4th century AD and who was martyred for his loyalty to his faith. His church became a center of pilgrimage during the Middle Ages, and St. Martin became one of the most familiar and recognizable of all Christian saints. But how his name was adopted by this church is uncertain, except that it was located on the prong of the St. Martin's River. St. Martin's Church, however, is not the only still surviving, well-preserved church on the lower eastern shore of Maryland. The Eastern Shore is fortunate to have many historic religious structures still remaining to tell the story of the important place of religion in the daily lives of the inhabitants of the Chesapeake area. In Snow Hill, All Hallows Episcopal Church, completed in 1756, of which St. Martin's was originally a chapel of ease, is one of those early Eastern Shore churches. West of Salisbury is Green Hill Episcopal Church, built in 1733 in Stepney Parish on the Wicomico River. Just to the north, outside Laurel, Delaware, is Old Christ Church, constructed in 1770 as a chapel of ease of Green Hill Church on the Wicomico. Near Salisbury also was Old Spring Hill Episcopal Church, constructed in 1773 as a chapel of ease of Green Hill Church. It stood until July the 23rd, 2014, when it was destroyed by fire. Near Pocomoke City is Rehoboth Presbyterian Church, dating to 1706, the oldest still active Presbyterian church in America. In Princess Anne is Menoken Presbyterian Church, dating to 1765 with additions dating to 1888. Also in Princess Anne is St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, dating to 1770. Much older still is Old Trinity Church, located at Church Creek in Dorchester County, built in the last quarter of the 17th century, the oldest Episcopal house of worship in America. Architecturally, St. Martin's Episcopal Church near Showell, Maryland, is a very fine example of a colonial brick Georgian structure. Vestryman Robert Kirby drew the plan of the chapel according to Articles of Agreement which laid out the plan for the construction of the structure. The builder was Worcester County James Johnson, who contracted with the church vestry to build the church levied from a tax in tobacco paid by parishioners. Bachelors were especially singled out to assist in the construction of this church by paying a hefty tithe, as we see in this parish register list. The church is a two-bay central door sanctuary. The quality of construction work of the building perhaps explains, at least partially, why the building still stands after so many years of dereliction and non-use. The walls of St. Martin's are 2 bricks thick and about 22 inches thick at the base of the building. The walls themselves are more than 20 feet in height. Original plans had called for the church to be 40 foot by 40 foot square. In 1762, after the construction of the church walls, there was a disagreement between the builder James Johnson and the vestry about further features of the chapel. This legal case was heard in April term 1762 by the Maryland Provincial Court. Later records indicate that the interior was created by William Tunnell, not Johnson. When the church was finally constructed, it was 44 feet wide and 54 feet in length, which remain its present dimensions. The church is constructed of Flemish bond brick. Flemish bond uses 2 kinds of bricks, headers and stretchers laid alternately. Each header is centered with the stretchers above and below it. The Flemish bond headers are the bricks which are laid so that the short ends show, thus giving extra support when coupled with stretchers. These headers are glazed. Glazed headers refers to the thin, glassy ceramic coating of the bricks caused by the firing process. Stretchers are those bricks laid so that the long side of the bricks show, not the glazed end of the bricks. These bricks are not glazed on the sides. The Flemish bond headers and stretchers are clearly seen in this close-up of St. Martin's Church. Another feature of St. Martin's exterior brickwork is the beveled water table. The water table acts as a transition between the thinner upper building walls and the thicker foundation walls. It is a typical feature of 18th century Georgian architecture, which is both ornamental and functional in that it keeps water away from the floor joists of the building. Here, on the west end and corner, we see clearly the water table standing out from the walls of the church. There was a beveled brick cap of rubbed brick on the water table. Put holes or putlock holes were bricks deliberately left out of a facade as it was being built. Some experts believe the holes were for anchoring horizontal wooden scaffolding, as the masonry needed repair from time to time. In this case, however, the omitted brick was probably for some environmental reason, perhaps to allow air to flow under the structure. Because it was hard to transport brick long distances in colonial times, most brick ended up close to its manufacturing site. Bricks were often made close to a water source, a stream of water. The quality of the brick is entirely dependent on the attention the brickmaker pays to each step, including the clay, sand, and water mix, the initial drying time of the brick in the sun, and subsequent air drying in the shade, and the firing temperatures of the kiln itself. Rubbed brick can be seen on corners of the building, around doorways, and in arches over the windows. Colonial Williamsburg brick masons indicate that underfired salmon-colored bricks were used because their faces could easily be ground to provide sharp corners and tight mortar joints. This detail was copied from fashionable homes in England, the mother country of most of Williamsburg's residents, just as it was for the residents of the eastern shore of Maryland. Grapevine joints were used to make the brick look square. The hand-molded brick rarely had perfect square faces, so the masons drew the joints with a straight board and a skate runner type tool. The construction of the roof of the church was carefully attended to. The roof was shingled using cypress wood shingles. Cypress wood was easily obtainable as the cypress swamp was but a few miles west of the church. One original shingle survives, having been found in the eaves of the church and never having been used. It is seen here to the right of this image. It was 29 2/4 inches long by 4 1/2 inches wide. In the center is a round butt fragment of a shingle which has seen much use. To the left is the modern replacement shingle which was used to cap the roof during its recent restoration. This view shows the 18th century rafters during the reconstruction work of the 1990s, while this image shows the roofers placing the new shingles on the church roof. The present roof, like the original, is pitched with a heavy cornice overhang and cove-molded kicked eaves. The cornice is plastered with white plaster overpainted with red ochre. This kicked eave and plastered cove cornice was a standard among the 18th century Delmarva churches, such as those of All Hallows, Green Hill, and Spring Hill. This close-up shows the detailed finish where the eave joins the roof. This covered eave shows the typical finish details on 18th century Georgian structures. Other external features of the church are its imposing windows. The church has 2 windows at the east side, and 2 on the north and south sides, and 1 on the west second floor elevation. Just as impressive as the huge windows are the jack arches above the windows. Lime putty was used in the spaces between each of the bricks of the jack arch. The jack arches are of rubbed brick with a prominent keystone in the center of the jack arch. The original 25-pane double-hung windows were replaced with new windows, replicating the original 11-foot high windows. All surviving 18th century sash was reused where possible. The original 18th century molded sills had survived intact. However, the timber frame surrounds had been partially stripped of their moldings with installation of the mid-19th century board covers on the top half of the window openings. Aged cypress was used in the restored window sashes. At the time of the restoration, it was discovered that the mid-18th century pulleys of the windows survived, although the weights and cords had been removed. Although there is no evidence that shutters were actually installed on the original church, by the mid-19th century, shutters had been installed to protect the windows. The white shutter to the left is the pre-restoration divided shutter, which had been placed on the unoccupied church during the 19th century. The shutters used today, seen on the right of this image, are in keeping with shutters on other known structures of the same time frame. Vandalism necessitates the usage of shutters to protect the historic rural structure. There are two doors on the church, although both have been damaged by vandals and needed to be restored. The main south door, seen here, was originally planned to have a companion door opposite it on the north side of the church. Although damaged, one half of the south entrance door survived to provide exact details for the restored doors. Each panel of the door consists of tongue and groove vertical raised panels which have flush horizontal battened backs. Each half-leaf door is hung with long strap hinges. A large iron wooden case lock was handcrafted and placed on the central southern door. The external main door has a ring knocker and handle and an impressive large iron lock and key. For added security, the door interior has wrought iron tooth lock closures, as well as a kick lock at the bottom of the door. The entrance door had a rubbed red brick border to set it off from the rest of the brickwork of the structure. Above the door exterior and its 25-paned window is a rubbed and gauged brick jack arch with OG scroll decoration. The west single door has the same depth of detail as the south entry door had. It has the tongue and groove molding and vertical raised panels characteristic of the period. It also has an elaborate Jacobean OG design on the jack arch above the door. The door clearly exemplifies the desire of colonial craftsmen to depict their skill at their craft, as well as demonstrating beauty and functionality. Both exterior and interior woodwork were painted a red ochre, according to the original records of the building. That red ochre had been used throughout in the restoration, as we see on the doors and on the exterior windows and shutters of the church. In 1761, carpenter William Tunnell was charged with doing the interior work at St. Martin's. He was contracted by the vestry to finish the chancel and the end gallery, quote, in the most convenient way as the vestry shall direct in a good and most workmanlike manner, on or before the last day of October next, and the said William Tunnell to have the sum of 27 pounds and 10 shillings for the said work, end quote. In May 1763, Tunnell was asked to create gallery pews for an additional 50 shillings. On the interior, A late 19th century stove chimney rose in front of the central gallery and was removed in the late 20th century renovation of the building. Originally, the ceiling had been a barrel vault. That vaulting was removed in the mid-19th century when wooden ceiling panels that you see here were added. When those 19th century ceiling boards were removed, the arch or curve of the original barrel vault of the ceiling was made visible. The ceiling was restored to its original low barrel arched form. It was plastered and whitewashed to make the restoration conform to the church's original structure and appearance. As completed, it looks much like it would have looked in the 18th century when it was constructed. According to historian Paul Tewart, the entire undersurface of the King Post roof truss construction was cut to accept a barrel vault of lath and plaster. The 18th century trusses were maintained and used in restoring the barrel vaulted ceiling. In this image, we see a detail of the rafters and roofing with the large diagonal bearing beam of the roof. To keep the roof frame from stretching, a series of iron tie rods were installed near the central rafters to keep the roof frame from spreading further. The original contract did call for 5 pair of tapered principal rafters, all of which we can still see in this view. Paul Tewart notes, however, that the massive King Post trusses went unmentioned in the contract, as did the large bearing blocks undercut with the cove upon which the rafters rested. In this view, we can see the huge support beams and rafters calculated to make the structure stand for many more years. The seating gallery on the second floor is approached by a plain stair set against the west wall. This contemporary image shows the stairs as they move upward toward the gallery. The original paneling of most of the gallery is still intact. The gallery had box pews, much like those on the floor below. Here we see a detail of a newel post in the upper gallery pew seating. Here we see some of the original gallery partitions still intact during renovation. Here, the gallery is shown as reconstructed with original fabric still in place, adjacent to the newly built wooden sections, which you can clearly see differentiated. This gallery view shows the placement of the pews in the sanctuary, while this cutaway sketch shows the interior of the chapel as it would have looked around 1800. Originally, the church also had a gallery on the south wall prior to the 1840 changes. The south gallery might have looked much like this one at St. Mary's White Chapel in Lancaster County, Virginia. In the 1970s, a recommendation was made to restore this gallery, although that was never made a reality. In addition, during the restoration, the raised panel face of the existing west gallery was stripped of its gray-green paint. Antique yellow pine lumber was used in creating structural pieces for the gallery facade and posts. This architectural rendering shows a bird's eye view of the floor plan of the church with placement of the 31 family pews. According to the contract mentioned in the vestry minutes, the vestrymen began to lay out the double pews of the new church by November of 1760. These images show the double seating area of each pew mentioned in the vestry record. The parishioners drew lots to determine the positions of each family's pew. The vestrymen had their first choice of the pews before the parishioners selected their pews. This list from the parish register shows which families chose which pew for themselves. Raised panel wainscoting enclosed the floor-level pews. The original pew woodwork was dismantled in 1999 in preparation for the restoration of the Chapel of Ease at St. Martin's. On the floor level, as the restoration efforts moved forward, the pew partitions were removed, exposing the floor framing below, which was dismantled also and discarded. During the 19th century, a wooden floor had been installed to replace the original brick flooring. This flooring was removed during the restoration. It was during this restoration that the remnants of the original center north-south aisle were discovered. The 18th century brick was salvaged and relaid throughout the center aisle and other aisles of the church. The 18th century pew plan was also restored at this time. The church floor plan used what was called the auditory plan and was created so that there was little social division between parishioner and clergy, and so that all communicants of the church could hear equally well. The single-room sanctuary was centered on a central pulpit with all worshipers could see and could hear the minister who stood above them with the sounding board above his head reflecting his voice. According to the Maryland Provincial Court Order of April 1760, the pulpit was contracted to be raised 5 feet from the floor with steps, rail, banisters, canopy, reading desk, and vestry pew, and to be painted like the doors and windows. Although the contract called for a door opposite the southern central door, the pulpit, as finally realized, was directly across on the opposite wall from the main south door. Evidence for the raised pulpit was found on the north wall opposite the entry door. The positioning of the pulpit is based on the paint outline found on the wall of the church when infrared photographs were taken of the walls. Using the original pulpit of Christ Church, Laurel, Delaware, constructed in 1774, as its model for St. Martin's, a raised pulpit with a canopy, dubbed the preacher snuffer or sounding board, was created. The pulpit complex was elaborate, as prescribed by Maryland law. Church records confirm that the pulpit was a two-decker type. It had not only the pulpit raised 5 feet above the floor level with a canopy, but it also featured a separate area for the reader of the Psalms. At the lower elevation, below the pulpit, was a litany desk where the Bible would have rested and from where the Psalms could be read. There was also a riser upon which the clerk would stand to read from the Bible. This frontal view of the pulpit shows clearly the rail and steps, as well as the pulpit and sounding board, all of which had been mandated by law. While this side view of the pulpit area more clearly shows the separation of the pulpit from the lectern or reading desk, as well as a seat for the clerk. Since there is no evidence of a font, it is probable that a silver vessel was used for that purpose. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the original rectangular shape of the altar area had been changed to a semicircular form, which you see here. Then it was changed back again to a rectangular platform during the second quarter of the 19th century. In the restoration, an altar enclosure railing was installed as it would have been in the original floor plan. The altar tablets and communion table were built during restoration. The altar tablets were inspired by those found at St. Mary's White Chapel Church in Lancaster County, Virginia. A wooden ledge on the east wall indicates the height at which the original tablets had been installed on the wall. The churchyard was used as a burial ground. Although one of the still surviving tombstones is still on the north side of the church, ground-penetrating radar revealed that there were burials on the south side of the church as well. Inside the church itself, during the 18th century, at least 3 ministers were buried under the brick floor. The Reverend Edward Dingle, active when the church was built, was interred in front of the pulpit. Reverend William McClanahan, who followed Reverend Dingle, was buried in the northeast corner of the church, and a third minister, Reverend Samuel Tingley, who served the congregation in 1798, was buried in front of the altar. By 1755, the population of Worcester County was growing rapidly. The population of the county in that year included 1,768 free whites over the age of 16, excluding the 760 enslaved persons. The underage population, in particular, demonstrated rapid growth. 4,150 youth under the age of 16 and 1,072 enslaved under the age of 16. In spite of the size of the population, in 1755 there was only one clergyman listed among the taxables in the entire county. After the Revolutionary War, the Anglican Church lost much of its power and income, and the Anglican Church was disestablished. It was no longer the state church. Many communicants left St. Martin's to join the new Methodist denomination, which was gaining many supporters. During the period between 1794 and 1844, the church building deteriorated since there were long periods of vacancy and only sporadic use. St. Martin's was for a time used as a church school for the parish for children in the Showell neighborhood, and it was even used as a Methodist chapel for a period of time. In 1806, the vestry had begun to meet in Berlin rather than at St. Martin's Chapel itself. And by 1824, St. Martin's was almost totally abandoned. Stevenson's Crossroads to the south of St. Martin's gradually expanded and eventually became the village of Berlin. By 1823, Berlin had 20 houses, 2 stores, and some small shops, but no church or school. However, in 1825, St. Paul's Episcopal Church was built in Berlin. Services and regular use of St. Martin's were at that time discontinued after St. Martin's was constructed. The late 19th century saw little use for the structure. The Eastern Shore Churchman magazine of 1925 reported that the people of the neighborhood have begun to use the church as a barn. The windows were broken, plaster torn away in places from the walls and ceiling. The pew enclosures, even the gravestones in the churchyard, had been carried off. The church had deteriorated to the point that vandals and visitors damaged the remaining pews and set fires inside the building for warmth. Graffiti became commonplace. By the late 20th century, structural failure in the principal rafters caused the collar beams to fail, forcing outward pressure on the north and south walls, resulting in the bulging of those walls. Finally, in 1975, St. Martin's Church was listed on the National Historic Register of Historic Places. thus strengthening its chances for survival. However, restoration plans did not begin until the 1990s, when discussions about the preservation of the church resurfaced. Increased vandalism and neglect had led the Worcester Parish to establish a St. Martin's Church Foundation to preserve the church and to restore it to its rightful place among the significant historical structures of the Eastern Shore as it stands today. Thank you all for coming today to hear this presentation on St. Martin's, and I look forward to seeing you soon.